Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes.
cool. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Um, okay. I guess I'll start. Okay. Um, okay. Thank you very much. So I just need to. I'm just trying to get rid of this part here. Um, I'll move it to the side. Okay. So I'll be presenting. I'm Raymond. I'll be presenting. I'm part of MST Team 4, and I'll be presenting our work on a minimum spanning tree approach to bond yields in COVID-19. Okay, so what essentially we're looking at how COVID-19 affects financial markets, and particularly an instrument financially we'll be looking at is government bonds. So this is essentially kind of bonds which the government issues, which people are allowed to purchase, allowed to have. And these government bonds have a yield. So this determines the return on that bonds after certain maturity. And this can potentially be a good indication to the sovereign debt, to the financial health of that country. And so we're going to be looking at the correlations of those yields, particularly within the 2020, within this COVID-19, and comparing that to 2019. So a historic comparison. And then once we form those correlations, we're going to be looking at the most important ones. So which countries are most influencing others or most correlated, and then from that, constructing our network, a tree-like network, and then assessing it through various measures. Okay, so for example, what's a bond? So I'm if I purchase a bond for £100 with a 10-year maturity, which is for 10%, I would expect at the end of that 10 years to have £110 or a 10% return on that bond. And this data is reported daily, can be found in various sources displayed in the slide. And we're going to be looking specifically at the January to April date, so the most recent data on these yields. And then we're going to be looking at 3 different maturities. So a bond with 3-month maturity, 1-year maturity, and a 10-year maturity. I should say as well that in terms of these maturities, that the countries do slightly vary, and that's because some countries do not issue some of these bonds. So, for example, Hong Kong issues 1-week bonds, US issues 50-year bonds. So it really does vary, but the ones we're considering are some of the most common. And then what we find from 2019 to 2020, in terms of, first of all, the yield, so this is decreasing. So we see that actually you're getting less return on that bond in this year than you would last year. And then also the volatility, that's increasing. So essentially kind of the losses or the potential losses you can have on the yield. So for that to be decreasing is also higher. So it's less of a safer yield that you expect. And then we're going to be constructing our networks from this minimum spanning tree approach. So first of all, we're looking at correlations. We're going to be using that in terms of a matrix where every entry I and j, that's the correlation value. Properties is that the matrix is symmetric, and also it's the diagonal is equal to 1. We also have as well that to define our notions of weight, we're going to be using this DIJ measure, distance. And what that means is that the most correlated values will give us the smallest distances. And then from those DIJs, once we construct those edge weights, we're going to choose the smallest ones. And that's done by this MST, so kind of a greedy type algorithm where we essentially choose each edge such that the network is connected, it's undirected, and also there's no cycles. And usually we'll see n-1 edges for n nodes. What we find is that in terms of our bond yields is that the picture may be a bit hard to see, but the main thing is that from 2009 to 2020, there's a much stronger distinction in geographic terms of country correlation. So in this 20, we see that, for example, we have the Southern European countries here, much more correlated. We have Germanic, we have English-speaking countries, and we have and then other countries. And we see those correlations a lot more stronger than 2019. And then just some various network measures comparing these different maturities, that what we find is that we find with the distance and the degree is that the distance between 2019 and 20, that's decreased, which means the correlations have increased, and which means that the kind of how the correlation values are stronger. And in terms of the degree, that's roughly stayed the same, which means that actually we're not seeing one country, lots of countries correlated to one country. It's actually, the spread seems to be quite even. But then some differences, particularly with this 10-year maturity, is that, first of all, the variation is decreasing with our distances. And also the max clustering, which is considered kind of the clustering which with the most nodes, that's also changed. So this is something where we're thinking about a bit more in terms of, this sort of effect, particularly with this 10-year bond. And just really kind of summarizing those points, that with the yield, it is decreasing and the volatility is increasing. We see from particularly that picture that was representing that 1-year bond is that we find that there's a strong clustering between certain geographical groups. We find that the correlation is also increasing in 2020. In terms of the degree, that's staying the same. So that measure of centrality, that's kind of staying the same between 2019 and 2020. And they also find that for 3 months and 1 year is that the variation clustering are equal, more or less similar, but this is not the same for the 10-year. Thank you very much.
If anybody has any questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat, and the rest of your group, Raymond, could answer with that.
Yes, yes.
Patricia, you up next for your group with Sandra and Tyler. If you could take the screen.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Let me screen share. Sorry, one sec. That is not what I want. I want here. And can you guys see my screen yet, or?
Not yet.
No,
No.
Sorry, one sec. Oh, here we are, share screen, here. Share. Okay, can you guys see now?
Yes.
Okay,
Right.
cool.
Yes.
So we are a reading group representing literature review for studies on mitigation strategies for reducing transmission. I'm Patricia McNeil. I'm going to be speaking for our team for right now. Maybe if Sandra can join us a little bit later, I'll pass it off to her, but if not, I'll also be able to cover those slides. And then we also within our team is Tyler, who wasn't able to make it today on scheduling conflicts. Next slide. So for our literature review, we wanted specifically to overlook mitigation strategies, specifically the non-pharmaceutical interventions. And we wanted to look at literature that related non-pharmaceutical interventions to political decisions that have been happening over different countries, just to understand more about how transmission measures over a worldview result in different strategies to help contain the disease. And then the second half of our review also includes papers that relate between social behavior and some simulations for these social behaviors in order to model what kind of strategies might be effective for containing the virus. So in literature, we found that there are two main methods that we want to look at. So we either want to look at suppression, which the aim in suppression is to include things like social distancing, closing of schools, voluntary home quarantine, and all of the usual non-pharmaceutical interventions that we've been hearing a lot in the news today. to try and reduce the total number of transmissions to a way either where it completely eliminates it from eliminates the disease from the population, or at least reduces it to where it can be manageable. But the issue with suppression is that it needs to be maintained at least intermittently in order to keep the virus from circulating in the population. Otherwise, some literature have shown that you do see a rise back in the viral transmission rates after the suppression measures have been lifted. And the second method is using mitigation. And here is the aim is to use NIPs just to minimize the transmission rate so that the population is able to respond in an appropriate manner in terms of being able to have enough hospital beds and being able to have enough supplies for healthcare workers to deal with the number of transmissions that are going across the community. So the two papers that we're going to be talking about today, the majority of which I kind of covered in the impact for non-pharmaceutical interventions. And then moving forward, we're going to talk a little bit about these interventions among different countries, starting with this paper on estimating the number of interactions of non-pharmaceutical interventions in European countries. And then later talking about some of those interventions that we've seen both in Mexico and in Japan. Side note, I'm currently staying in Japan on an internship, so I've had some firsthand experience seeing some of these measures on a more international scale, which has been really interesting. So to continue forward, like I said, summarizing some of the non-pharmaceutical interventions or NIPs include case isolation at home, voluntary quarantine at home, which is different from case isolation in that the voluntary quarantine includes quarantining people who have other people who have the virus at home, not just quarantining yourself if you experience symptoms. And then social distancing for the elderly, or general social distancing for the entire population, as well as closures of public places such as schools, universities, and then also things like museums and theaters and other public places. So here we have a general case where we can see intervention timings across European countries. And generally it shows when each of these different mitigation steps or each of the different NIPs started to come into effect across the different countries. And represented include Australia, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Norway, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, and the UK. And we're hoping that having an understanding of when these NIPs come into effect for if, say you were to try to match this up with transmission rates, you might be able to see either suppression or greater transmission depending on if the different NIPs were implemented later or earlier. So specifically, we also did an extra detailed study on both Japan and Mexico. So this is the graph that we were able to compile for Mexico. You can, included in this graph are the different policies that go into effect, event description, and the specific dates that correspond. So closures of universities, banning from public effect starting from March 16th, closure and isolation at home, also starting March 16th, March 24th, voluntary home quarantine, social distancing for elderly individuals, starting March 24th, and then March 30th, you have social distancing for the entire population, ban on public events, and closure of schools and universities. And then for April 16th, you just see the extension of social distancing across the board. And then Sandra also provided with a similar graphic as the one that was presented for the European countries to mark what types of NIPs correspond with what dates. And similarly, I was able to produce a graph for NIP timings in Japan. So for this one, it also included reduced entry for foreign travelers. This came about in the essence of the fact that many foreign travelers for entering Japan need a letter of guarantee to be able to visit the country. So what they did is they would ban on very large tour groups, and the tour groups usually provided the letter of guarantee, and hence this type of ban helped to reduce entry without specifically having to ban anybody in particular. And then they also included barring entry from visitors specifically from the Hubei province starting on February 1st. The Prime Minister requested school closures starting February 27th, reduced major events and attractions, and also increasing test availability throughout February. March is when we see a lot of quarantining and closing of public spaces, including voluntary quarantines and increased travel warnings, and then also reduce major events and attractions, so such as kabuki performances, as well as closures of museums. And then finally, the state emergency recently went into effect on February 6th, where we have the absolute social distancing across the board. And then similarly, Sandra was able to provide us with a infographic that included some of these measures that went into effect. How am I doing on time? I don't know if I went fast or slow or not, but I'm at the point where any questions?
You have 5 minutes left if anybody has any questions.
Sorry, I expected to have to pass it off, so I imagine I was probably rushing quite a bit. I can also expand on some of the state of emergency measures I've been personally experiencing, if that's something we're interested in. I'm trying to look and see the questions, so. Where are the question tabs?
Please feel free to type questions in the chat room.
Okay. I'm currently not seeing any questions. Is that correct? Or, I mean, that's perfectly okay too, but.
Yes. Thank you
Okay.
so much, Patricia. Thank you. And we'll pass it over to Richard, who will be screen sharing for the next session.
Hi, folks. Can you see me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. All right. So my name is Richard. Oops. And so I'm a PhD candidate at University of Maryland in the School of Public Health, and my focus is mainly in environmental epidemiology. So I've kind of posed the question, kind of given Dr. Scarpino's recent amazing talk about the role of mobility on transmission. Well, I'm kind of posing the question about the role of weather, especially given kind of these recent outbreaks of extreme weather events that's been going on in the southeast. So the question I'm kind of looking at is just, you know, does it have an effect or an association with respect to case numbers we've been seeing in the last few weeks? So this was my one slide pitch that I gave last week. Again, just kind of using preliminary information data that I've used in some of my other work where I'm looking at medically fragile populations and the role of weather. But in this case, instead of looking at mortality and hospitalization, now I'm looking at coronavirus cases within certain selected areas across the US. So the method I used was actually kind of a commonly used, at least the approach for looking at lag effects, the idea that exposure that happens on one specific day can have an effect on a population in other days or days that's kind of past that particular exposure event. So the modeling approach that I'm using is something called distributed lag nonlinear modeling. So it's able to model out these sort of temporal patterns. That's typically very complicated if you do not adjust for a long-term sort of series or a time series. But in this case, we're looking at kind of a shorter-term time series. But fortunately, we're kind of at an advantage where we have a substantive number of cases that we're looking at every day. So our statistical power is somewhat maintained. And this methodology was actually kind of put together by an academic hero of mine, Antonio Gasparini, and his colleague, Ben Armstrong at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So this particular model that I'm using, we're able to kind of estimate the association between not only an exposure and outcome, but among exposure, lag and outcome. So we're able to kind of determine a certain risk with respect to a certain day or period, and we're able to kind of determine if there is what is kind of typically seen as a delayed effect or a lagged effect. And we're able to also have this sort of nonlinear component where we're able to model out functions with respect to the lag response in linear polynomial step or splines. So the data sources that were used, as many of you might be familiar, Johns Hopkins Center for System Science and Engineering has some fantastic data sources. I was able to extract some data through their GitHub repository, and I was able to apply a rolling 5-day average for our case numbers. And then with respect to data, NOAA was kind of my hub to go to. And then for my regression fit, I used the Quasi-Poisson, adjusting for date and day of the week, and applied a knot per week of data that we've been observing, so about 5 weeks worth of data. So here are some outputs here that was, and again, this is all preliminary, and I've kind of focused on Washington, D.C., but I've done analysis for multiple locations. So with respect to precipitation, we're able to see rainfall and lag in the X-Y axes, and then we have a rate risk here, or rate ratio, sorry, with respect to the Z. And we're able to see in this kind of this very fun-looking plot that, you know, there is some dimensionality with respect to the risk of corona cases across across rainfall, but also across lag. So if we were to do a cross section with respect to 1 millimeter rainfall and 15 days after the exposure event, because it's kind of assuming that there has been, say, incubation that has occurred, we're able to see that, in fact, after 15 days, we're seeing kind of like this sort of dip in terms of the rate risk, or rate ratio of coronavirus. Even though it's already kind of within DC, it's already kind of a relative low risk with respect to rainfall, but we're seeing this sort of major dip below between 10 to 15 days. Then with respect to temperature, we're also seeing that in DC, we see this sort of spike or increase with respect to what I consider the minimum temperature for at the 10th percentile. So it's about 30 degrees for DC. And we're able to see after day 10 of exposure of that particular day that we're seeing this sort of decrease in risk as we kind of approach further along on the lag structure or lag axis. And then I kind of create a kind of a bad weather sort of variable, and bad weather being not only just rainfall, but also looking at, say, fog, or looking at other sort of undesirable sort of weather that may kind of preclude people from wanting to go outside. And we're able to see with respect to DC, we're kind of seeing the same sort of pattern where after the event had happened, maybe about after 10 days, we're able to see this sort of decrease or gradual decrease of the risk of contracting coronavirus, or at least coronavirus, increasing of coronavirus cases. And then looking at New York City, the same trends kind of seem as well, but we're seeing a little bit tighter variability. And I guess that's attributed to kind of the larger sort of data that's available with respect to New York. And then lastly, we're looking at just kind of a weather perception and also wind advisories. So this is kind of more of a binary sort of outcome we're looking at, whether there is a wind advisory day or no advisory day. And we're able to see that DC, kind of a similar trend where we're kind of seeing this sort of maximum sort of point here, but after the 15, 16 day, we're seeing this sort of decrease. And I'm fixed on 15 just because I believe that the incubation period is about 2 weeks with respect to presenting symptoms or potentially knowing that you might be a case. And then Philadelphia as well here, we're able to see that there's sort of this sort of dip here around after up to 15 days, and then sort of increase as well. So just kind of very quickly, some findings we found, we found some potential associations between weather types and COVID-19 cases. So something maybe to consider in modeling out, say, our R0s that could potentially help inform local transmissions. We're able to see these sort of change or trends with respect to discrete lags. And this is not necessarily generalizable across each location or across the country. Location matters. And based on some of the preliminary work that I've done, we're definitely seeing like states like California, like Southern California, where bad weather doesn't really have that much of an effect, but more to come. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Richard. Does anybody have any questions? I know there was one in the chat. How many days of bad weather wind advisory occurred during your time frame?
So with respect to DC, we have actually, I'm sorry, I can't see the chat, but we've had actually pretty terrible weather this past month. So not only, to add to the gloom of this pandemic, we have some not such great weather. So fortunately, we've had a number of days where we had wind advisories. So in fact, the pool of cities that I looked at, only 2 cities were able to demonstrate the wind advisories, which was Philadelphia and DC. So there's a cutoff as far as what is considered a wind advisory. So depending on what kind of wind measurement you use, usually it's a gusty wind measurement or a sustained wind measurement, there's a cutoff. So for gusty winds, for example, it's anything above, I believe, 41 miles per hour, and that counted as a gusty day, or excuse me, a wind advisory day.
Thank you. Anybody else have a question to post in the chat? Given the stay-at-home orders, would very good weather make more of a difference than bad weather? That's from Jeffrey to you. Yeah,
no, that's a great question. So it's kind of hard to say right now, and I think the method that I'm using, unfortunately, is not going to be able to answer that until we kind of go further out, I think, along the pandemic, and as potentially some of these social distancing sort of requirements might be lifted or relaxed. So there's another methodology that I'm actually interested in using called interrupted time series, where you can actually kind of follow way further along to the scales of months and maybe with, maybe years, who knows, but we would be able to kind of see a little bit more clearly the difference between, say, how people kind of respond to bad weather during a period of stay-at-home orders, and then also during a period where there may be relaxed or lifted stay-at-home orders. But I guess TBD.
And thank you. A question from Maria. Would these findings also apply to regular flu, but then wouldn't people get less infected during winter?
Yeah, so I think this is just unique right now just to COVID-19, because I think there's certainly seasonality with respect to the flu, from my understanding. But I think there's just kind of sort of unique sort of aspects to what we're experiencing with the coronavirus, where there's no vaccinations, there's really no therapies. and we're kind of learning and picking up things on the fly. And I think the only thing that's kind of been established, or as far as a therapy, is kind of what the last presenter mentioned, was kind of this non-pharmaceutical or this behavioral sort of approach. So I honestly don't know. I just know there's been a lot of like seasonal forecasts that's been used with respect to the flu, and the flu being a completely different sort of virus, where there's a high mutation rate. It's a little bit more, I guess, predictable and not predictable, depending, I guess, which camp you're in. So there's already kind of winter weather forecasts are used for that, and they're special to that virus. But for this virus, yeah, I think we're on uncharted territory, which is why we're all here, just trying to make sense of it.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that. And we will now move on to our final session for the day, which is with Jeffrey. Thank you.
Hello, this is Jeffrey Herman, and I'm working on sharing my screen. Okay, so I'm here for our team. Our project is on epidemic spread and hierarchical network models, which we've called the Persephone Project. And I want to thank all my teammates for all their work on this and helping making this presentation. We're concerned about universities and the need to protect their community from COVID-19 when the university resumes classes. And the ultimate goal is to create models that university administrators can use to evaluate the impact of mitigation policies and practices of different types. Here in this figure, we've modeled the university as a network of buildings, and the different risk management policies are put into place to kind of prevent the spread of the disease by preventing certain movements between certain types of facilities or reducing interactions. Really, in general, this could be different types of gatherings, not just buildings. Buildings are just kind of a convenient way of thinking about it. And there's all different types of mitigation policies that universities might put in place. They may choose to use smaller classes in larger classrooms so that students can spread out. They may have restrictions on extracurricular activities, keeping certain types of facilities closed. They may ask the staff to continue telecommuting so they don't come to campus and don't infect each other or students. They may deliver food from the dining halls to the residence halls so students don't have to congregate. There's all different types of practices. And the university administrators would like to have some idea of which of these practices, if any, can help mitigate the spread of the disease. So in order to do that, we've begun by looking at some data that was previously collected as part of the Copenhagen network study. And this work collected data about students in multiple ways, but it especially collected data about when students were close to each other by recording their Bluetooth connections between their cell phones every 5 minutes. So whenever two students were close to each other, their phones would make a Bluetooth interaction or connection, and that would be recorded. And the range of this interaction was about 10 meters or 30 feet. And they collected this, they released a data set that has 4 weeks worth of data. And so we started by looking at this data to get some understanding of how the students' contact networks might look. So one thing we could do was to create a graphical model Here we have a graph of the Bluetooth interactions from this data set. As you can see, it has 692 vertices that correspond to the students and all 79,000 edges. And we generated that using Julia. Here, an edge in this graph represents two students, or connects two students who interacted at any time during the 4-week period. Okay, so that's helpful, and it gives us a big picture look at how the students are connected. But then we wanted to kind of figure out, well, which students are most connected to each other. So then for each of these edges, we can basically add a weight, where the weight is the number of times the students interacted during that 4-week period, right? The number of samples where their cell phones were within 10 meters of each other. And then we could group the students who had the most interactions together. So we chose to use a spectral clustering technique. One of the benefits of spectral clustering is it does not require us to determine the number of clusters ahead of time. It basically maps the data into a reduced dimensional space and then does a hierarchical clustering on that reduced dimensional space. And then what we did was we kept the clusters where the average interaction between persons was at least 14 hours over this 28-day period. And many of the clusters were very small, just 2 or 3 people, but there were a few large clusters as shown here. And this is a timeline. This graph shows a timeline for the largest cluster of 23 persons. So in this figure, we have one row for every day in the data set and one column for every hour. And the number in each cell represents the number of persons in that cluster who interacted during that hour, interacted with at least one other person in the cluster during that hour. So we can see for this cluster, many of the interactions were during sort of a weekly cycle, right? That we know that the first day was a Sunday. So we know they interacted on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then the next week on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and the next week and so forth. So they had this weekly pattern, and many of the clusters that we found had this weekly pattern. So that indicates perhaps that these are students who are in the same set of classes, or possibly students who are working at the same place, but probably students in the same classes. This cluster, however, had a very different pattern. Here we see this cluster had 6 people, and many of the interactions were late at night or early in the morning and on the weekends. And so this pattern may represent a cluster of students who live in the same residence hall or the same apartment and are basically close to each other much of the time because of their residence. We're not sure, but the key thing is that it suggests a different pattern. And that leads us to think about separating the students into different subgroups based on different clusters. So our next steps are to formulate a model, a multi-level model, where we have different subgroups that would represent different clusters. And people in these subgroups go to different gatherings, which might be classrooms or meetings or whatever. And they might be in different locations or not. And then within that, they have different disease state using kind of an SEIR model. And then that changes over time. The disease state changes and the students move from gathering to gathering. And we might be able to build this model based on interaction data like we have from that we've already begun to analyze. So our status is that we've generated this formulation of the disease spread model. We've analyzed the student contact data from the Copenhagen network study. We're grateful for that data. And we've developed a model to simulate the spread over the contact network. Unfortunately, I don't have time to show that today. Our next step is to evaluate and compare the disease spread in a baseline scenario and scenarios where the clusters do not meet, and then also consider different time intervals to find different sets of clusters that have frequent interaction. And I'll stop there and be happy to answer any questions that are in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions for Jeffrey? Thank you. Is this data set from a regular time or from COVID times?
It was collected before the pandemic.